we're going to talk about the Executive Order 9066. And like some of you know, the Executive Order 9066 is what led to the Japanese American internment camps. Today, I have two great panelists with me, Peggy Nagai and Amy Yogi. They have, either throughout the work or because of the community they belong to, they have been having conversations or working on the issues that came from that executive order. So we're gonna hear from Peggy Nagai first, and Peggy will introduce herself. And I'm gonna invite you to pay close attention to what she has to say, because she has a lot of expertise in this area. Then we're gonna hear from Amy Yogi, who also have done some work around this here in our community in Lane County. And at the end, if we have more time, we may allow the audience to ask few questions through Facebook. So please welcome Peggy Nagai.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for inviting me to be here and for talking about Executive Order 9066. I'm also, thank you for your program, Human Rights, Human Stories, which is wonderful because I believe we're all connected by our stories. So a little bit about my background. I'm from Oregon. I grew up in Boring, Oregon. And Boring, Oregon is not an adjective for the state of Oregon. It's a place in Oregon. I grew up on a farm. And part of, I think, growing up on a farm and growing up in Boring is that I was in the country. I was one of only 2 students of color from the 1st to the 12th grades in education. And because my parents and all my relatives were incarcerated during World War II, they came back after the war and started all over again. And so we grew up really poor without indoor plumbing, eating government surplus food in the winter. And that informed, and their experience informed my career. I grew up in the 60s, so a belief in civil rights, a belief in that we can change. And I went to law school. I never met a lawyer before I went to law school, but worked in a resort in Lake Placid, New York as a waitress. And we didn't feel that we got fair wages, so we were going to strike. And the maitre d' said, because we got paid by the number of people that sat at our table, he said, "What are you two complaining about? You get lots of guests." And we said, "Yes, but it's unfair because it's not equity." And he said, "You have no labor laws protecting you. We could fire all of you tomorrow and get a whole new crew in. And besides, our board of directors is composed of 11 lawyers from New York City." And I'd never met a lawyer before, but I said, if they're that powerful, I'm going to law school and fight for social justice, which is what I did. And in law school, in constitutional law, I actually hated law school. It was really challenging for me. I thought about quitting every other day. Then I thought about, what am I going to do if I quit? But in con law class, we read the Korematsu case. And that case went to the US Supreme Court, and it said that it was constitutional to incarcerate a group of people based on military necessity. And so I sat in class and thought, if there was anything I could do to write these cases, it would make these 3 years of torture worthwhile, i.e. the 3 years of law school worthwhile. But what can you do? It went to the US Supreme Court. There's nothing else you can do after that. And so I just kind of trudged on through. 5 years later, I realized what you could do, because people had found evidence in the National Archives that said back in 1942, when the decision to have the curfew, to exclude and to incarcerate happen, the decision was not based on military necessity, but based on race. And that the formation of Executive Order 9066, which was signed by President Roosevelt and was neutral on its face. In other words, it didn't say we're going to exclude all the Japanese Americans, we're going to incarcerate all the Japanese Americans. What it said is that the military has the right to decide who can stay and who has to leave this Western Defense Command, which is most of Oregon, most of Washington, most of California, and on down to parts of Arizona. So the general who made the suggestion for Executive Order 9066 and the politicians did it not based on military necessity, because they actually had documents that said that the Japanese are not a threat, or the FBI said we've been surveilling their community for years. We know that there are, the ABC list of people who might be causing danger. But nonetheless, the president decided to go ahead with this executive order. It became the basis for 120,000 people to first go to leave and go into these local detention areas. In Oregon, it was the Portland Livestock Pavilion. So they took the horses out, put straw down, and brought in the people. And that was in May of 1942 until September of 1942, in which during that time, the military was building incarceration camps, 10 of them throughout the United States, for civilians. And then they had Department of Justice incarceration camps for Japanese American leaders who they took right after Pearl Harbor and incarcerated them for the length of the war. So my parents were first incarcerated in the Portland Expo Center, and then went by train in the dead of the night to Minidoka, Idaho, Burley, Idaho, out in the middle of the desert, where they had tar paper barracks, 10,000 people per camp, with a surrounding barbed wire fence and machine gun towers with soldiers pointing their machine guns in towards the camp. So why did this happen? And why do we think it just started in 1942 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor? Because really, when it started was in 1790. The Naturalization Act of 1790 said that Congress passed this, that said that the law limited naturalization to free white people of good character, thus excluding Native Americans, indentured servants, enslaved people, free Black people, and later Asians. Although some free Black people were allowed citizenship at the state level in many states. The courts also associated this whiteness, free white people of good character, with Christianity, and thus excluded Muslim immigrants from citizenship until 1944. So the setup for who has a right to be an American, who has a right to rights in this country, started in 1790. And there's a series of history events that happened. The Chinese immigrated in the 1800s. Why? Because the US wanted cheap labor. So they recruited people from China to come as people in the railroads or in mining camps and different areas of the country. And these were brought by white US American folks who wanted cheap labor. And that happened. And then slowly there's a backlash, an anti-Chinese backlash that resulted in 1882 to the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was the first time where color was used to exclude people and nationality was used to exclude people. So it was Chinamen, prostitutes, and people with diseases could not come into the country. And after that, people still wanted free, cheap, or not free, but cheap labor. And so US folks went to Japan and started recruiting Japanese immigrants to come to the US to work on farms and the railroads and in lots of different places. So we're talking about a history that was far before 1942, and that there were anti-Chinese laws, and then there became anti-Japanese laws. You couldn't become a citizen. My grandparents, who were the first generation called Issei, could not own land. They were prohibited in Oregon from owning land, from testifying in court, from having business licenses, all of these restrictive rights. And they base it on, if you're ineligible to become a citizen, then you're ineligible to own land, to have a business license, to testify in court, all of these different things. So you can see how the rights were hooked together. And when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in 1942, he should have known better, because there were reports from the Office of Naval Intelligence, from the FBI, from the Federal Communications Commission, from his own person, Mr. Munson, who went out to the West Coast to look to see what was going on. All of these government entities said, you don't have to incarcerate Japanese Americans. So the question is, why was it done? Well, a commission was formed in the 80s, a congressional commission, and they took testimony. They looked at all the documents, and what they said was, this happened. Executive Order 906 happened. The incarceration of 120,000 people happened because of racism, because of a lack of political leadership, and because of economics and a fear used mainly against the U.S. population in general. We're not surprised about that, because they've used fear about terrorists and Muslims and who's the terrorist after 9/11, and on and on and on. So one of the things that happened is as they started rounding up people, there was one person born in Hood River, Oregon, Minoru Yasui, who was 25 years old at the time, who had been an undergrad. He was a double duck. He went to the U of O undergraduate, graduated Phi Beta Kappa, ROTC. Then he went to the law school, graduated in 1939, the first Japanese American student at the U of O Law School. He's the first Japanese American member of the Oregon State Bar. And he saw it, he was a lawyer. He saw the government put down the curfew, and he said, this should not be right. This is unconstitutional, based at least on citizenship. I'm a US citizen by birth, and restricting my rights without due process is unconstitutional. So at the age of 25, think about how old you are. I'm far from 25, but at the age of 25, I was in law school as a law student. And think about putting your liberty on the line and your profession on the line and saying, no one else is going to test the constitutionality of this law. I'm going to be my own test case. So that's what he did. He walked the streets of Portland. He had by then there was a curfew that you couldn't go out of your homes between 8 a.m. and 6 a.m., 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. And so he walked the streets of Portland. He had his papers saying, here's a curfew order. I'm Japanese American. Please arrest me. The first cop said, go home. You're going to get in trouble. So undaunted, he went into the Portland police station and said, curfew, here are my papers. So they did. They arrested him. And he spent the weekend in the drunk tank. And then what happened then was that he had a hearing, he had a trial. He then went to the incarceration camp in Minidoka while he awaited the outcome of his trial. The judge said that this is unconstitutional. This executive order is unconstitutional as it pertains to U.S. citizens. But Minoru Yasui, you're not a U.S. citizen. You abdicated your U.S. citizenship because you went to Chicago and worked for the Japanese consulate. Well, he went to Chicago to work for the Japanese consulate because he couldn't find a job after law school. And finally, he got a job at the consulate, translating things, doing other things. Once Pearl Harbor happened, his father sent him a telegram and said, quit your job, you have to come home. He was in ROTC anyway, and so he thought he would volunteer and be put into combat. He tried 7 different times to activate his ROT status, and they rejected him every time in Vancouver, Washington. So this is a long history of anti-Asian hate and discrimination. I know that people thought it started with Trump and the coronavirus, but it started a long time before then. The response by Japanese Americans, the Issei generation had come as immigrants. Many of them did not speak English. My parents, who were born and raised here, were called the Nisei generation, the second generation. They were largely in their 20s in 1942. My father had to scramble to try to get the farm leased, because if they couldn't lease the farm and they had to leave and they couldn't pay for the mortgage, the farm would be foreclosed. So it was a situation where you could take as much as you could carry. You had no idea where you were going or for how long you were going, and actually why you were going. So if you can imagine, my mother was 19, and the idea of being 19 and not knowing where you're going, taking as much as you can carry, not knowing if you're going to come back or when you're going to come back, it's almost unfathomable for me to think about that. I mean, and that was just a generation ago. So that's a little bit about the background. I guess the other thing that I would say is we did find documents that said that the incarceration was based on race. And so in the early 80s, we reopened the Korematsu case, the Hirabayashi case in Seattle, Washington, and the Yasui case in Portland. And I became Min Yasui's lead attorney. And these 3 cases went off on 3 different ways, but we did get the conviction, Min's conviction, overturned. We didn't, however, have the right to an evidentiary hearing to show the documents that said this is not based on race. This is not based on military necessity. It's based on race. So we were appealing that decision from the district court to the Ninth Circuit when Min passed away. So it was with much sadness that happened. It felt like unfinished business. So I was happy in the 2000s, 2014, we started an effort to get Min a Presidential Medal of Freedom. And if Bonnie Souza is on this call, she helped out in the early days of that. So we knew that if we had to run an entire national grassroots campaign to have him even be considered, there would only be one Asian recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian award in the country. There was unwritten, unspoken rule that there could only be one Asian American. And so we had to get all the Asian politicians and all the Asian organizations to agree that it was going to be Min Yasui. And finally, we did that. Senator Hirono carried the nomination to the White House. And I had the privilege of going to the White House in November of 2015 to see Barack Obama award the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously to Min Yasui via his daughter. And little did I realize later that he's the only Oregonian to date to have received a Presidential Medal of Freedom. That next year, 2016, we went to the Oregon legislature and got a bill passed for a permanent Minoru Yasui Day, which is on March the 28th, the day he defied the curfew. And every year we have a Minoru Yasui Day. This year it will be on April 1st from 1 to 3. It will be in person at the White Stag building, and we'll live stream it as well. So if you can somehow get your name to Ibrahim or somehow, then we will send you, we're happy to send you an invite, and it's free. All right, so am I done? I think we're pretty close to that 30 minutes.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead. All right, go ahead. All right, so Executive Order 9066 also spawned redress and reparations. So in the 70s, Edison Uno was the first person to say in 1970, we should go for redress and reparations for Japanese Americans. But of course, nobody had talked about their experience. And it was frightening. I mean, you can imagine it being frightening to take away your liberty, your possessions, all your freedom. And so the Nisei generation was reluctant, obviously, to really bring it back up. We were the Sansei generation. We were the third generation. We had the opportunity to go to school. So between the Nisei and the Sansei, we did start a movement for redress and reparations. And I was honored to serve on the National Redress Committee for the Japanese American Citizens League. It's the Japanese American Citizens League, as well as two other organizations that really pushed for redress and reparations, as well as the Congress people, all congressmen, I think, from Japanese Americans from California and from Hawaii. And the 442nd Infantry Battalion, which was the most decorated infantry battalion of its size in the history of the military. It was an all Japanese American battalion. The 100th Infantry came from Hawaii. So all Hawaii folks met up with the mainland Japanese Americans to form the 442nd. And they were the most decorated combat unit, including getting the Texas Battalion out from a war situation in which the Japanese American soldiers incurred more fatalities than the number of Texas Battalion people they brought out. They also were some of the first people to go into Dachau, Auschwitz, and some other places, but they wouldn't show that on US national TV because they wanted white soldiers to be portrayed as liberating those death camps. But the people in France and other areas knew that the Japanese Americans soldiers had done that and have celebrated and honored their contribution to their liberation. So in some ways, they're more well known in Europe than they are in the US. While Min Yasui passed away in 1986, he was involved in redress, but he did not see it come to fruition, in which President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that allowed for an apology and for a small pittance of redress. And I could go into more of that, but I'm going to stop now and turn it over to Amy. And then if there are questions, I would love to hear questions that I can respond to. I want to know who's in the audience and why the heck are you here? And what do you want to know? Okay, Amy.
Okay, thank you very much. I will be sharing two stories. The first is about the Japanese American internment here in Eugene and Lane County. We have recovered that history fairly recently with the awarding of honorary degrees to the students who had to leave the University of Oregon in 1942. So I would like to share that story and the remarkable effort that the University of Oregon did to help those students at that time. The second is a personal story. My experience, I grew up in Hawaii, so it's rather different from in the Japanese American community, and it's rather different than Peggy's experience. However, we are at this time, because of a serious reckoning that the Hawaiian Japanese Americans had to process and go through, we are definitely much more united in our reaction and to the internment of Japanese Americans and the large-scale injustice to that. So first, I'll talk about the internment of Japanese Americans in Eugene and Lane County. Of course, well, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and war was declared against the Japanese armies or military, the next day it precipitated the Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, and it established a Western Defense Zone, which included the state of Washington, Oregon, California, and a part of Nevada. And the military had the right to distinguish or designate the people who were national security threats. And the Japanese were singled out for that. So the mandate went forward for curfew of Japanese Americans and the forced removal, taking only what they could carry from the Western Defense Zone, all of these states. So that included Oregon. And when we look at the records of Lane County's records of Lane County residents who were Japanese Americans, we find 3 people, and all were University of Oregon students. So we looked at the University of Oregon, which was the center of the Japanese American community. They had 23 students enrolled at that time in 1942. I'd like to read their names. Chie Arai, Harry Yoshiro Fukuda, Midori Funitake, Mary Furusho, Frank Hachiya, Ted Hachiya, Thomas Hayashi, Woodrow Ichihashi, Kenji Inahara, Harold Ito, Makoto Iwashita, Grace Ikuko Kumazawa, Alice Kawasaki, Takuo Kawauchi, Samuel Teruhide Naito, Kenzo Nakagawa, Ellen Ogawa, Lawrence Takei, George Uchiyama, Hitoshi Watanabe, Michi Yasui, Robert Shu Yasui. So these young people were facing forced removal and incarceration in concentration camps. 20-year-olds, a couple of medical students, because Oregon Health Science was based in the University of Oregon campus at the time. And on March 8, 1942, the University YMCA, which has hosted a men's dormitory, received a letter from the national office. They inquired as to whether the university had Asian international students whose countries were in the midst of World War. And they were offering to supply funding for their support. However, Dean Carl Onthank, who was the Dean of Personnel at the university, replied that there were 2 Japanese international students who had already been picked up by federal authorities. But what, he asked, was being done for the Japanese American students? He said, most of them are keen, alert young men and women headed toward professional and important business activities. They are surprisingly unresentful of the popular demand to move them back from the coast. They are, after all, American citizens, and we shall have them to live with and deal with anyway after the war. It appears to me that this network might perform an important service, particularly toward easing the way for them to transfer from coast universities to institutions of non-defense areas. He was already thinking of how to transfer our University of Oregon students to other campuses and universities inland. So on March 17, he wrote to his colleagues in other universities on the West Coast. There were an estimated 2,500 Japanese American students. The University of Washington had 456, Berkeley had 420, UCLA had 250, and USC had 131. Although the University of Oregon had a small enrollment, he expressed how unfair it was that the students had their education interrupted because of the actions of another country, Japan. And mentioning Minoru Yasui, on March 28, our first law school Japanese American graduate challenged the military curfew in Portland. On March 31st, the university administration was able to assure their students that if they registered for the National Japanese American Student Relocation Council, they would be transferred to a college inland to continue their studies. Carl Onthank was one of the leaders, along with the national offices of the YMCA, the YWCA, the University of California, was one of the leaders to establish the National Japanese American Student Relocation Council. So they would assure the students that if they signed up, registered with the council, that upon admission to another college, someone would pick them up, whether they were in an assembly center or an internment camp, and drop them off at their new university. In the meantime, colleges and universities were asked to admit our students to programs and medical schools. At the University of Oregon, 16 registered, 4 opted to go home to help their families into the camps. On May 9th, U of O President Donald Erb reported to his staff that a waiver they had requested to permit Michi Yasui to attend graduation exercises was denied by the Wartime Civil Control Administration. Michi Yasui had completed her curriculum of coursework for elementary education degree and was set to graduate. Graduation was going to be on May 31st, and the university offered full supervision on that date from morning to after graduation, and to escort her to boarding the train on the assigned date of her removal from the area. The Civil Control Administration denied it and implied that the order to evacuate would occur before May 31st. So on May 13, Michi Yasui stood outside the train station in Eugene because she had heard that her family had boarded the train in Hood River, her mother and her younger siblings on their way to incarceration in California. She did not see them because the curtains were drawn, but they reported that they saw her standing on the hill beside the train station. When attendance to the graduation ceremony was denied, she boarded a train to Denver, where she joined her brother, Robert, who had left Eugene earlier in the year, and he offered that she could finish her degree in Denver and find work. So she left before the evacuation or the mandate to be removed. So on May 23rd, the students had returned to their home counties to board the trains or to be removed to the assembly centers with their families. And the 3 residents of Lane County were directed to board the train on May 27th at the Eugene station to be taken to their final designated concentration camps. By May 28th, 1942, there were no Japanese Americans in Eugene or Lane County. On May 31st, the National Japanese National Japanese American Student Relocation Council was established by the YMCA and the YWCA. The American Friends Service Committee managed the tracking of the young students and transported them to their educational institutions. By September 1943, the council had placed 5,000 Japanese American students in 529 colleges and universities. So this information, by the way, is being added to the Eugene Japanese American Memorial. The memorial, the Friends of the Japanese American Memorial say The Memorial Plaza serves to remind us that racist fear should never result in the targeting, internment, and incarceration of any individual or group without due process of law, as stated in the US Constitution. And we are reminded that Min Yasui said, if we believe in equality and democracy, then each of us, when we see or believe errors are being made, has an obligation to make every effort to correct them. Okay, so I'd like to, since Peggy mentioned the unification of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team with the 100th Battalion from Hawaii. This was a large merging of two Japanese American populations, a very, very different culture. And I'll explain that because it has an effect on their perception of the internment. The interesting thing happened that she mentioned was that the 442nd segregated regimental combat team was at the liberation of Dachau in 1945. And yes, nothing was ever said of their participation. They were there early. So they had an idea of what concentration camps were. And when the gates opened and they saw the survivors coming forth, they also saw the bodies, the stacks of the bodies. They could smell the stench from the ovens that were used to incinerate the bodies. And they realized the final solution. And when they talked with their companions from the mainland, as opposed to Hawaii, when they talked to their companions, they realized that their families were in concentration camps and how worried they were about them. They had no power of knowing what was happening or was this going to happen to them. Another interesting group of segregated soldiers, American soldiers, were the African-American troops in General Patton's Tank Corps. They were segregated because they were thought not good enough to fight in combat with white soldiers. But they arrived. General Patton made all of his tank corps deployed. He deployed them all, rotating into the liberation of the concentration camps so that they would see the devastation of the Holocaust. So here were young African Americans, descendants of slavery, descendants of lynching, discrimination, genocide, and segregation. Yes, discrimination. They were treated as second-class citizens, even in the military. They saw the final solution. And I have to believe they stayed and aided the survivors who emerged. And I have to believe that for these two groups who have suffered so much injustice, they realized that when they return home, life was going to be better for their future generations, for their families and the future generations. So these veterans returned, and we can see, we have heard about the survivors coming out of the internment camps, the Japanese American survivors coming out and saying, having faced this injustice, realizing that African American history is all about that. And so, yes, we understand. And so there was no doubt that they would be with Martin Luther King in 1963 for the March on Washington. They were there. So that's one ramification of this terrible, terrible injustice, is the realization of what other groups have experienced. So now I'd like to switch to the my personal history story about the internment and growing up in Hawaii. The story begins when my grandparents immigrated from Okinawa in the early 1900s. My grandfather came to Hawaii. He was a sugarcane grower in Okinawa, so he was brought by the plantation to grow sugarcane, and he was able to bring my grandmother in 1912 and start a family. And so my father and my grandmother eventually had 7 children to work on the farm. But anyway, a sugarcane farm. But anyway, my father and his older sister, my Auntie Flo, graduated from Hilo High School in the late 30s. And education was just very important. We Japanese Americans had that, they had the freedom to earn their own money, to send the best they could do was to send their 2 oldest children to college, to be educated, to be better, and for women to become teachers, to teach the children of future generations. So my father and his older sister worked very hard to go to college. She wanted the best she could do is to become an elementary school teacher. So she majored in education at Oregon State University here in Corvallis in Oregon. My dad was able to go to Iowa State University and majoring in horticulture and animal husbandry. However, he found he would come back to California and work in the fields to earn money to go to Iowa State. And at one point he found that there were good jobs to be had in Honolulu because he could drive heavy equipment and work for the Navy at the construction of the Red Hill Fuel Supply Depot. So he came back to Honolulu, and in 1941 was working for the Navy in Honolulu. And he hoped to earn enough to finish his last year at Iowa State. On the morning of December 7, 1941, he happened to be at the dock at Pearl Harbor Naval Base. He witnessed the attack on the fleet. He said when he saw the rising sun insignia on the planes that were dropping bombs and torpedoes, his heart broke. The Japanese were trying to kill him because he was an American. And in Oregon, my Auntie Flo faced the Executive Order 9066, which mandated curfew, forced removal, and incarceration in a concentration camp. My aunt and uncle married. He had just graduated from Portland State University. They were married on May 1st, and by May 6, 1942, they were at the Portland Assembly Center, the stables of the Pacific Exposition Center racetrack. 23 years old. They took with them only what they could carry. And 4 months later, they were on the train to Minidoka in Idaho. My family would not hear from her for 3 years that she was in the Minidoka internment camp in Jerome, Idaho. Our federal government did this to her, a 23-year-old college student, because she was an American of Japanese ancestry. What happened in Hawaii during the war is different from what happened here on the mainland. In 1940, the Japanese Americans in Hawaii were the largest ethnic group, numbering around 160,000 or 40% of the population. We had immigrated for the sugarcane work, and we stayed. We raised our families. And when the war started, the next day, martial law was enforced, and it had effective control of everyone, which included the curfew, blackouts, and surveillance. Removing or incarcerating the Japanese Americans, who comprised the largest agricultural labor force, would mean the failure of Hawaii's economy. Consequently, a small percentage of community leaders, Japanese language teachers, Buddhist and Shinto priests, and highly placed Japanese citizens were arrested and detained and sent to Army or Department of Justice detention centers on the mainland. And because removing and incarcerating all Japanese Americans was impossible, we formulated the erroneous assumption that no Japanese American was imprisoned in Hawaii. That was a powerful and erroneous assumption that would come back and haunt us. In the decades after the war, the belief created a division between the Japanese Americans on the mainland and the Japanese Americans from Hawaii. I know I experienced it when I came to school here at the University of Oregon in the late 60s. The Japanese Americans from Hawaii were accused of privilege, majority privilege, because there were so many of us. We didn't need anybody else, and we didn't care about anybody else. We did what we wanted to, and really, we've heard the Japanese Americans here on the mainland talk about the internment. Well, that's old history. Get over it. And the Japanese Americans here looked at us and shook their heads and just said, privilege. You're good as white people. In 2010, an inquiry to the Honolulu Japanese Chamber of Commerce came from the Schindler's List movie company that would generate a reckoning for the Japanese Americans from Hawaii. This movie company was asking about the Honouliuli internment camp, which had held European Jewish nationals or international citizens of European Jewish descent, German descent, or German prisoners of war, Italian prisoners of war, Japanese prisoners of war, and Japanese American citizens. This was a shock. This was a shock that here were our friends and family interned, imprisoned at Honouliuli, and we didn't know about it. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, Honouliuli was a secret site because it housed confidential or prisoners of war or internment inmates. It was 1,500 Japanese American internees from 1943 to the duration. So, and the internees, of course, were reticent to speak about it because it would cast shame on their families for being suspected. So the response then from my generation was anger at the injustice and the whole spectrum of reactions that had been experienced by the Japanese Americans on the mainland for decades. We responded with the actions of the recovery of the site, the recovery of the people that had been interned. We had analysis by 10 faculty members of the University of Hawaii and a documentation of the after effects of their experiences in the concentration camps. The site was recovered. The internees were memorialized. The site is now a National Park Service site with tours, interpretive explanations, descriptions of the injustice. So we are there. We are there and we understand and we are united with the Japanese Americans who had suffered this injustice decades before. So it's much more, we are reconciled with our history. It was painful, but we appreciate having discovered that. And it also brings up, why does it keep happening again and again? With the Trump administration, or we started the Asian celebration because there was a trade war with Japan. They sold more Japanese cars here than General Motors. So there was a trade war, and we wanted to highlight, we wanted to showcase our Asian American culture so that our children would have something to identify with, to be proud of, and to show the value of our culture, what we held in this community. So I say it's a long history. I think it's getting better. I think it gets better every time we look at our painful past. It certainly the Eugene Japanese American Memorial had to look into the past, the painful past of our students going into internment. But I think we are healthier for that. And
Wow.
I think Min Yasui was right. He said, never give up, because democracy is definitely not a perfect system. It requires our diligence and our work.
Yeah. Thank you. I really, wow, what to say. These are two great panelists, and it's understanding on what led to the 9066 and what followed, and how through lawsuit, but also fighting back, community leaders putting themselves out there to fight against injustice led to the government itself recognizing that there was a wrongdoing. And your story about your father being right there when the bomb were being dropped on Pearl Harbor, while his sister was being arrested here in Oregon. That's compelling. So for time reason, we're gonna take one question, and that question is coming from Bonnie Souza, and Bonnie would like Peggy for you to talk about the effort currently underway in Portland, where immigrant stories are being shared, including stories within Portland Asian and Japanese American community. You're muted.
Thank you. Hi, Bonnie. It's good to know you're on this call. The Immigrant Story is an organization in Portland, similar to and different from human rights and human stories, but they tell very much immigrant stories of people who've come to this country on various and sundry ways. And there were four of us that told our stories several times, but it is in an attempt for people to understand what other people have had to endure and come through to actually be in this country. And that some of us have been here for generations, but not seen as that, still seen as forever foreign. So Sankar Rankin is the leader of that. And they have, if you Google immigrant story in Portland, you'll see many of the stories there. I have one last comment that I forgot to make. Can I make that comment?
Yes, yes.
And that is General DeWitt, who was the one that suggested the incarceration, said, he wrote a report that said that it didn't matter how long or how much effort they took. You couldn't separate the loyal from the disloyal. You couldn't separate the sheep from the goats. A Jap is a Jap, and the Japanese race is an enemy race. And that was the military commander of the Western Defense Command. And the courts had often said, well, it was because of time, and because of time, they couldn't separate out. But clearly from that commander, it was not about time. It was not about the war. It was about a race that was an enemy race. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind. When war happens, the courts back away from their role of looking at why some people are being separated, why the Muslim ban, why we've been fighting all this time for the rights of Muslims, for the rights of other people, because of what happened to Japanese Americans.
Wow. Thank you, Peggy. And I know Amy is also collecting stories. They have been doing that here in Springfield. I'm gonna encourage each and all of you to go online and or send me an email. I will send you the right information to find more information about what Peggy and Amy are doing. And I want to thank the two of you for taking this time here. I think we really needed like 2 hours. I will check back in with the panelists and maybe schedule another time when we're gonna talk about specific areas of this topic because it's so big. It happened over, I mean, during World War II, but impact, it changes a lot of things. It changed a lot of things throughout the years. So, and we are using a new platform today. So we have some technical difficulties. We will keep working on that. So right now we have around 167 attendees on 5 platforms, which is great. And we'll continue to do that. And Human Stories is dedicated to bring stories to you and share, take some time for us to listen to what sometimes we seem to know a lot about, while in reality, it's just things that we see here and there, phrases we hear here and there that do not give us a real insight of what the problem is in our community. So thank you to my panelists. Thank you to the audience, and we'll see you soon around. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.